Hey everybody out there, it's me, Rabbi Pinchas Landis of Partners in Torah of Cleveland, and we're here for another episode of Back to the Past. I apologize that we got a little bit of a late start here tonight. One of those weeks since we got a little bit of a late start, but we're now here rocking and rolling, ready to continue with the story of Jewish history that we've started. We're now up to episode 3, I believe, right? Episode 3 here. And in today's episode, we're really going to get into, it's all exciting. All of Jewish history is exciting. But we're going to get into now the story of the Exodus. We're going to complete the story of the Jews in Egypt. And we're going to touch on the Exodus of the Jews leaving Egypt, the Jews making their way to the land of Israel, the Jews making their way through the desert, and everything that is contained there within. So anyways, I apologize for the late start, and we'll get rocking and rolling now. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us. If you're seeing this on Facebook, good to have you. You can text in your questions as you have them, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And for those of you following the YouTube camera, this will be posted later tonight. So here we go, episode 4. Yeah, we're up to episode 4. I got my notes up here. And episode 4, we were discussing when the Jews finally leave Egypt. After the 10 plagues, the Egyptian economy is brought to their knees. Pharaoh is ready to give up. He's done with the Jewish people, and he just says, get out of my country. Now, what's interesting is if you look in the original request of Moses for the Jews to leave, he originally said, we want to go for 3 days just to worship our God. That request never changes to let us go altogether. So that actually, we're going to see, comes back to be a little bit of a catalyst, a little bit of an impetus for what happens next. But nonetheless, on the 15th of the month of Nisan, in the Jewish year 2448, and the secular year 1313 before the Common Era, the Jews walk out of Egypt on the 15th day of the month of Nisan. They walk out, as the Torah tells us, biyad ramah. They walk out with glory and everything, not like a slave's escaping. They walk out in the middle of the day. Pharaoh already told them to leave in the middle of the night. They said, no, we're going to wait till the day. We're going to go out like we're supposed to go out so everyone knows that this is our choice, that you didn't have an option, and we are going out. And that's what that happens. They go out as victors. And this event is really the event of the Jewish people. So much of what we have in Judaism is what we call Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim. It's a remembrance. It is a for us to recall the exodus from Egypt, because this is when our people began. This is when the Jewish people truly started to be a people, and therefore we remember it literally in everything we do. Of course, we have the whole holiday of Passover, which revolves around it. Shabbos revolves around it. We talk about Shabbos being Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim. Our tefillin that we put on, literally everything goes back to remembering that we were slaves in Egypt and then we got out of Egypt. Okay, so we go out into the desert, and the first 3 days pass. As we said, Pharaoh thought they were only going for 3 days. When he had scouts out to make sure they came back after 3 days, the 4th day comes, he says they ain't coming back. And he takes whatever is left of his army and he chases after the Jewish people to try and conquer them. And he thinks he has an advantage here. Now, I think that was kind of dumb of him at this point because he just went through a year of plagues. But he thinks, at least from a military standpoint, he has an advantage because he knows they're heading straight for the Sea of Reeds. In Hebrew, we call it the Yam Suf. In English, we call it the Sea of Reeds. It is not the Red Sea. It's a big debate as to what exactly it is, but it's some body of water that separates somewhere between between Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. So he says, we got this advantage. They're heading towards the water. Their backs to the water. They don't have a chance. Let's go after them. And he chases after them. Well, that was his final mistake because, as we all know what happened, he chases after them. They're up to the sea splits, and one of the greatest miracles ever happened in time. The Jews walk through, they go through onto dry land. The Egyptians are really dumb enough to follow them into the sea, and the waters come tumbling down on them. That happens 7 days after the Exodus. That happens on the 21st day of the month of Nisan, and that is observed as a holiday too. The holiday of Passover is 7 days biblically, and the diaspora add on the 8th day. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because there's bookends. We have the Exodus, which is the first day, and we have the splitting of the sea, which is the seventh day. And we have the intermediate days to connect them together. But that's why we have a 7-day holiday, and that's why the seventh day has holiday status, just like the first day, because that's when we're commemorating that the Jews went through the sea. Okay, finally we go through the sea, we're safe, we're ready to be a free people. So the question is, what next? The problem is they were still slaves, not physically, but mentally. So even though they were free physically, they needed the directive on how to live as Jews, and that was going to happen at Mount Sinai. But it couldn't happen right away. It was a 50-day process. It took them 50 days of raising up, so to speak, from Egyptian culture, raising up from being slaves to be able to be on a level where they could receive the Torah. But 50 days later on Mount Sinai, and really probably the most seminal event in world history, the Torah is given. Now, this is an event that you read about, and a lot of us treat it as fairy tale. We treat it as folklore. The Kuzari deals with it very differently. He says the whole description of Mount Sinai in the Torah is proof that it had to exist. Because you can't fake such an event, and you can't make people think that they experienced such an event. As we said last week, in last week's episode, in episode 3, there were about 3 million Jews that left Egypt. And then the Torah tells us that 3 million Jews stood at Mount Sinai. So 3 million Jews stood at Mount Sinai, heard God speak the Ten Commandments, heard God speak that Moses is going to give you all the details afterwards, and they all saw it, they all experienced it. That's what the Torah says. The Kuzari writes that if you were writing a Bible and you wanted people to accept it as historically true, you wouldn't put something in there unless it could be, you wouldn't put something in there like that unless it could be verified. Yet here, the Torah is telling us that every Jewish person who was alive at that time experienced Mount Sinai. 3 million people. We call this mass revelation. Now, what's the concept of how you couldn't fake it? Because, you try and slip that in somewhere, people are going to say, well, when did that happen? If you try and slip it in right away, you say, I didn't experience it. If you try and slip it in one generation later, you say, 1 second, I never heard about this from my parents. And the book also says, be sure to tell your kids about it. And I didn't hear about it from my grandparents. So at what point do you slip such a thing in? If such a seminal event is written, it must have taken place because the explanation defines its truth. Parenthetically, Judaism is the only religion that has mass revelation. I mean, let's face it, the best way to start a religion is to bring everybody together and tell them the basic tenets of that religion, right? That's how hey, if I was starting a religion, that's what I would do. But interestingly enough, every other major world religion basically says God spoke to a prophet, the prophet spoke to the people. One step in between. One man gets the revelation and speaks it to the people. Whether that one man is Jesus, is Saul, is Muhammad, is Siddhartha Gautama, whoever is Joseph Smith, whoever that one person is, it's one person who gets the revelation. Judaism says, no, we were all there. Now, why don't other religions say, hey, mass revelation, everyone's together? The reason is because you can't fake it. You just can't fake it. And that's why every other world religion, it's single-person revelation, and we have mass revelation because it's true. It happened. Seminal event in history. History here. So the Jews stand at Mount Sinai. That's the beginning, really, of the giving of the Torah. That point. And that happens 50 days after they left Egypt. Now, the 10 statements which happened on the 50th day, that's the holiday of Shavuos. That's what we observe as the holiday of Shavuos. That was really just the beginning of the process because, as we know, the 10 Commandments is not the whole entire Torah. There's 613 commandments in the Torah. There's 5 books in the Torah. That was not given on Shavuos. That was a process. But one of those main things that happened on Shavuos was the Jewish people hearing God say, these are the basics. Moses is going to now come up and get all the details. And that's what happened over the next 40 days. Moses goes up on the mountain to get all the details, to get the whole entire Torah, and he ascends to heaven to get it from Hashem, to get it from the Almighty, and then he comes back down. There's only one problem. In the meantime, while Moses was on the mountain, the people started to get a little bit worried about the situation. They started to get a little bit confused. They started to say, maybe Moses isn't going to come back. Maybe he just took us out of Egypt to let us die here in the desert. Or maybe the time period of the open miracles that Moses represents, that's over. That hasn't happened anymore. Many different explanations for what the rationale must have been for the Jewish people. Needless to say, it's very hard to understand. But before Moses ever comes down from the mountain, literally less than 40 days after they receive the Torah on Mount Sinai, they make the golden calf. Very hard for us to understand, but that's the history and that's what we're here to discuss. They make the golden calf. Moses comes down and says, what in the world is going on over here? And he has the tablets in his hand that he received on Mount Sinai. He smashes the tablets on the ground. He has a whole cleanup process to clean up from the golden calf. And he says to the Jews, okay, guys, don't worry about your own accounting. Don't worry about why you might think that that I'm not coming back. I'm coming back. I'm definitely coming back. Don't lose out this time. And he goes back up on Mount Sinai for another 40 days, and he prays to God saying, you know what? Give the Jewish people another chance. I can make this work with them. I can make them into the nation that you want to make them into. And God says, okay, we'll give them a second chance. So Moses comes back down from the mountain and says, good job, good, we did good, guys, good news. We're going to get another chance. God's not wiping us all out here in the desert. That was the first day of the month of Elul. So at this point, we're roughly 4.5 months after the Exodus. So we had Shavuos, which is the giving of the Ten Commandments, the beginning of the giving of the Torah. We had the golden calf. That took place on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, which is observed as a fast day. 40 days later, on the first day of the month of Elul, the Jews are told they're going to be given a second chance after the golden calf. And then Moses goes back on the mountain for 40 more days to again learn the entire Torah. That's our timeline here. Goes back up for 40 days, and he finally comes back down 40 days later with the second set of tablets, having learned the Torah anew for the Jewish people. And on that day, the Jewish people cry. They cry tears of happiness, of joy, of forgiveness, of atonement, because they realize that they dodged a huge bullet. And God says, the Medrash tells us, God says, because you cried these tears of slicha v'kapara, these tears of atonement and forgiveness, I'm going to establish this day as a day of atonement for all generations. And if you're following the timeline, if you're following the math, yes, that was Yom Kippur. That was the very first Yom Kippur, and that's when Yom Kippur became inscribed, so to speak, in the Jewish people as the Day of Atonement, because that was the day when it was clear that we were finally forgiven for what we had done at the time of the golden calf, and we were going to be able to have a relationship with Moses, have a relationship with God, and have a relationship with the Torah. At this point, we're roughly 6 months after the Exodus. 6 months after the Exodus. So what happens next? What happens next is it's a debate amongst the commentators. It's a debate amongst Rashi and the Ramban. We know practically what happens next. The question is, why did it happen next? The next seminal event is they build the Mishkan. The Mishkan was the portable temple that went with the Jews up until the time when they built the temple in Jerusalem about 400 years after this, roughly 400 years after this. And the Mishkan, by the way, it's often translated into English as tabernacle, but I find that nobody out there knows what tabernacle means. So if we're going to use a word that nobody knows what it means, we'll just stick to Mishkan. Okay? Deal? Good. I always find it funny. For those of you who've been listening to me for a while, you know that I'm very disturbed by translating Hebrew words into English when nobody knows what the English word means. Many examples of this. For example, tefillin, right? Those black boxes we put on in the morning when we pray, often translated into English as phylacteries. I don't think anyone out there knows what the word phylactery means. And by the way, it comes from the PH is like Greek for four because it's four compartments. But whatever, no one knows what a phylactery is. So you know what? Let's just stick to tefillin. You know, it reminds me once after 9/11, I was flying down to visit family for the holidays, and because of all the security, it took forever to get onto the plane. I had to daven on the plane. I put on my talis and tefillin. It's right after 9/11. Everyone's emotions are on edge, and like everyone goes crazy, hits their flight attendant call buttons, doesn't know what this guy's doing, putting this talis on and the tefillin, all these things. Thank God the stewardess, by the way, my wife pretended she didn't know who I was, but the stewardesses knew what I was doing and calmed everybody down, and everyone was fine. I finished praying, take off my talis and tefillin, go sit down. I'm ready just to fall asleep. I'm absolutely exhausted, haven't slept in a long time. And this lady comes up to me and says, so what were those little black boxes that scared the heck out of everybody? And I looked at her and said, oh, they're called tefillin. It's often translated as phylacteries. They have little portions of the Bible written on little parchments inside of it, and we put them on when we pray in the morning. Okay, it's like, why did I even bother asking? Anyhow, so here's a deal for Back to the Past. If there's a Hebrew word that the English translation doesn't make any sense, we'll just stick to the Hebrew. And that's the case of the Mishkan. It was the portable temple that went with the Jews in the desert, and that's where they, so to speak, communed with the Almighty. Now, the dispute that exists out there between the Rashi and the Ramban is what was the purpose of this tabernacle, of the Mishkan that traveled with the Jews in the desert. So Rashi says that the original plan, so to speak, was for there not to be a Mishkan. There was no need for a Mishkan. It was only after the golden calf that it became clear that the Jewish people needed some sort of focal point to connect with the Almighty. So that's why they had the golden calf. By the way, if those of you watching are wondering why my eyes are going back and forth, it's that we have two cameras here. We have one for the Facebook Live, and we have another one for YouTube. And I should probably try and line them up on top of each other so my eyes aren't jetting back and forth. But I apologize. Maybe for next week we'll figure it out and get it right in that regards. So anyways, so Rashi says that it wasn't part of the original plan to have a Mishkan. But once they messed up with the golden calf, then they needed a Mishkan. The Ramban says the opposite. He says, no, the commandment for the Mishkan happened before the golden calf. It wasn't until after the golden calf that they got a chance to actually build the Mishkan. But it was always part of the plan. Be it as it may, that starts, the process of building the Mishkan starts on the 15th day of the month of Tishrei, still in the already in the second Jewish year now, because we crossed over Rosh Hashanah already, so we're in the second Jewish year of the Exodus, the year 2449, 1312 before the Common Era, and they start building the Mishkan on the 15th of Tishrei, which becomes the holiday of Sukkot. And it's a process of building the Mishkan. It takes them several months. It takes them over 5 months, all the way up until the 23rd day of the month of Adar, when they finally finish the Mishkan. They dedicate the Mishkan, and at this point they're basically ready to go into the land of Israel. Right? It was originally supposed to happen, arguably right after Moses comes down with the tablets, but we got delayed with the golden calf, delayed with the building of the Mishkan. Again, according to the Ramban, they were always supposed to build the Mishkan. According to Rashi, they weren't always supposed to build the Mishkan. But now, finally, we're roughly 1 year after the Exodus. The Jews are finally poised to go into the land of Israel, and they start making their preparations. They're ready to do it. There's only one problem. For some reason, at this point, the Jewish people just still didn't get it, so to speak. So they come to Moses and say, we're going into this land. We don't know the first thing about it. Maybe we should send in some spies to check it out, to see what we're going to be dealing with in the land of Israel, to see what we're going to have to conquer. And Moses asks God. God says they want to send in spies. Let them send in spies. So they send in 12 spies. These 12 spies are literally the leadership of each of the 12 tribes. One spy from each of the 12 tribes. They're very great men. 2 of those spies were Joshua, who is so great that he becomes the successor to Moshe, and Kalev, who also is involved in the leadership of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, those are the 2 best spies, and the other 10 aren't so great. And there's a whole debate as to what's driving them. They're worried that when they go into the land of Israel, that their leadership that they have in the desert is going to stop happening. Be it as it may, there's 10 spies who go into the land of Israel to spy it out with Joshua and Kalev, with Yoshua and Kalev, and they come back with a negative report. And they come back and they tell the Jewish people, and they're there for a total of 40 days, and they come back and they tell the Jewish people, you know what, there's some great things about the land of Israel. It's nice, it's good. They have these really big fruits there. They have these big grapes. By the way, they come back. If you ever saw that emblem of the Ministry of Tourism of Israel, it's an emblem of 2 people carrying a big cluster of grapes. That is an allusion to the first tourists who ever came into the land of Israel, and they came back with a negative report. So I'm not quite sure where the marketing is there, but that's what they did. But anyways, they came back with these big grapes. They say there's giants in the land. They say, bottom line is, we can't conquer it. We can't do it. Okay, God says we can do it. We can't do it. There's no way we'll be able to do this. And the Jewish people accept the negative report of the spies. And they cry. And they cry, and they cry, and they cry all night long. At that point, the Almighty says to the Jewish people, he says, guys, you just don't get it. You're crying this bechia shel chinam, this meaningless cry. So because you cry this meaningless cry, ani kovei lecha bechia l'doros. I'm going to make this a night of crying for all generations. And that was the first Tisha B'Av, the first 9th day of the month of Av. That's when it happened. And that date is going to rear its ugly face, that bechia shel chinam, that cry that we're going to have to go throughout all the generations, is going to rear its ugly face time and time and time again throughout Jewish history. And we'll hear about it here on Back to the Past. I'll just give you an example. We'll do a quick fast forward. When is the first temple destroyed? Tisha B'Av. When is the second temple destroyed? Tisha B'Av. And the aftermath of the destruction of the second temple, there's two tragedies that happen. One is that the Temple Mountain is plowed over. One is the Bar Kokhba revolt. When do both of those happen? Or at least when the Romans put down the Bar Kokhba revolt and have mass bloodshed, a massacre of the Jews, probably up to 1 million Jews killed at that point, that's on Tisha B'Av. Jews in 1492 are expelled from Spain. When does that happen? Tisha B'Av. Jews are kicked out of England. When does that happen? Tisha B'Av. And the Jews, as we all know, before they came to America and to the land of Israel to rebuild the third Commonwealth, we all know that Europe was our home. And when did the lights, the beginning of the end, so to speak, of European Jewry happen? Well, historians will tell you that was the outbreak of World War I, and sure enough, that happens on Tisha B'Av. So, don't mess with Tisha B'Av. That's the bottom line we learn over here. But it began because the Jews said, we can't handle it. We can't go into the land of Israel. God said, you know what? You're not going into the land of Israel. It's going to be your children. You've shown here that you still have a slave mentality. You've shown here that you're not ready. So you know what's going to happen? Every night on Tisha B'Av for the next 40 years, you're going to die. You're going to die. When you reach your 40th Tisha B'Av, you're going to go out, you're going to dig a grave, and you're going to go down in that grave, and in the morning, your loved ones are going to come and bury you. And that's what happens for the next 40 years on Tisha B'Av. The spies were in Israel for 40 days. The punishment was 1 year per day. 40 years later, after that generation dies out, and everyone's buried, and the new generation's ready, finally, it's time to go into the land of Israel. There's only one problem. That in the last few months, when it was already basically time to go in, Moses, unfortunately, and it's a big debate and discussion as to why this is, but he hits the rock instead of talking to the rock. A big discussion as to why that disqualified him into going into the land of Israel. Be it as it may, it does disqualify him, and God says, you know what, Moses, you're going to have to die here in the desert too. So the leadership of the Jews in the desert, Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, all die before the Jews enter the land of Israel, and the last year in the desert. Miriam and Aaron die in the year 2487 on the Jewish calendar, 1274 before the Common Era, and Moses dies in 1273 before the Common Era. Now, before he passes away, he takes roughly 5 weeks to give his final discourse. He begins it on the first day of the month of Shvat, and concludes it on the 6th day of the month of Adar. That's roughly 5 weeks. So if you ever studied the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim, that is Moses' final discourse, and that book he gave literally as a 5 week talk to the whole Jewish people right before his life ended in the desert. So anyways, so Moses gives his final discourse, and on the 7th day of the month of Adar, he passes away, which parenthetically is his birthday. He lived exactly 120 years, and that's one thing we're told. The righteous people live exactly 120 years to the day. He was born on the 7th of Adar. He dies on the 7th of Adar, and that unfortunately is the end of Moses as we know it. Now, the Jewish people mourn for 30 days collectively after Moshe passes away, and in those 30 days they don't study Torah. They mourn. They're just still there in the desert. And during that time, our sages tell us they forgot a lot of the Torah that they learned from Moshe. And they try to pray that they should remember it, and they're not successful. Finally, there's a scholar by the name of Asniel ben Kenaz, who becomes the first judge of Israel. We'll discuss him next week, who is able to remember and to to recreate everything they learned from Moshe. So thank God they remembered it. Now, when Moshe passes away, as we said, his main disciple Joshua takes over. Now, what we learn over here is that Judaism is not really an aristocracy; it's a meritocracy. Because here, Moshe had two sons, he had Gershom and Eliezer, and neither of them take over. It's Joshua, his main disciple, he takes over as the leader of the Jewish people. And Joshua, in many ways, is Moshe. The Talmud tells us that Moshe kipnei achama v'Yeshua kipnei alavana. That Moses is like the sun, and Joshua is like the moon. And just like the moon gets its light from reflecting the sun, that's where Joshua gets his light from, so to speak. And he really, it's like having Moses there the whole next roughly 14 years that Joshua is the leader of the Jewish people. That being said, God says over and over again to Joshua, he says, "Rak chazak v'amatz," just be strong, because obviously, even though he was the student of Moses, he still needed a certain amount of strength. So, be it as it may, Joshua takes over the leadership. He's from the tribe of Ephraim, and the 30-day mourning period for Moses ends on the sixth day of the month of Tishrei. And on the 10th day of the month of Tishrei, the Jews cross the Jordan River. Again, it's a miraculous event, just like we had the splitting of the sea, we have the splitting of the Jordan River, they have the Ark of the Covenant that passes in front of them, the water split, the Jewish people walk through on dry land. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I've been to Israel. The Jordan River is more of a stream than a river in most places. What's the big deal that the river crossed? And those days it probably had a little more water than it does today, so it was regarded as another miracle when they crossed through the Jordan River on the 10th day of the month of Tishrei in a miraculous event. Now, the first city they come to is the city of Jericho, better known as Jericho. They come to Jericho, they send in spies. Pinchas and Caleb go in to spy it out. This time it's totally sanctioned spies, and if nothing else, they learned the lesson from the first time. And they check out the land, they see what they need to do, they're ready to go in. There is a prostitute by the name of Rachav who actually helps them out, and then is so inspired by what happened that she converts and joins the Jewish people, and her sages tell us she even becomes the wife of Joshua. And but be it as it may, the process with Jericho is basically like this. The Jewish people warn the inhabitants of Jericho that they've come to conquer the land that was theirs, that they've been given and promised by their forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they have a choice. They can either leave peacefully, or the Jewish people are going to have to attack them. Sure enough, the residents of Jericho say, "Who are you? We have our fortified walls. We're not interested in anything you say." And so the Jewish people say, "Be it as it may." They walk around the walls of Jericho 7 times with the Ark of the Covenant. The walls come tumbling down. The Jewish people go in. They take over the city. Very easy, no problem. Jericho is the first city conquered. Now, if you were one of the other Canaanite kings, by the way, there are a total of 31 Canaanite kings. If you were one of the other Canaanite kings at that time, what would you do? You see the walls of Jericho, which is one of the best fortified cities in the whole land of Israel. You see the walls just come tumbling down. The slave people, or the descendants of the slave people, just walk in, take over. Like, you would probably say, "Okay, we surrender. It's yours. We want to live peacefully. We'll just be a Ger Toshav," which we had the opportunity to be, and you can be the sovereigns of this land. But no. In every city they go to, when they come in contact with all the 31 kings, it's Jericho all over again. They're given the opportunity to step down peacefully. They don't. The Jews fight them. They conquer the land, and it's a 7-year process of conquering the Canaanite nations. And it was not easy, but it happens. And after 7 years, pretty much the whole of the Canaanite nations are wiped out by Joshua and his army. The only ones that are left, so to speak, are the Jebusites in Jerusalem, which it's gonna be until King David that they're gonna be taken care of, and the Philistines in the Gaza Strip. By the way, the Gaza Strip has always been a hotbed for problems, and there was no exception at that point in time. The Philistines are still there, and they're gonna really challenge the Jewish people for a long time, pretty much through the whole time period of the judges, up until the time period of the kings as well. It's interesting to point out over here that the Philistines are the last of the Canaanite tribes to survive, And that is why when the Romans take over Israel at the time of the Second Temple's destruction, they want to make the country completely Judenrein. They want to erase the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. So they go back to the name of the last of the tribes that were there before the Jews, and that was the Philistines. So if you ever wondered where the name Palestine comes from, Palestine is the Roman pronunciation, the Latin pronunciation of Philistine, or Philistine, or Philistia is really how they pronounce it. They pronounce it Philistia, and then it becomes Palestine. That's because they were going back to wanting to make the country Judenrein to get rid of the Jewish presence, and they went back to the last of the Canaanite tribes that survived, and that's what they called the land. And literally for 2,000 years, it's called Palestine. It's called Philistia. It's called after the Philistines. Now, what's interesting, and again, we're jumping ahead, but we'll jump back because this is back to the past, that the Palestinians have nothing to do whatever with the Philistines. Today's Palestinians have nothing to do with the Philistines. Today's Palestinians are Arabic people. They're descendants of Ishmael. They're from a whole different part of the world. They came in. Nothing to do with these Philistines. Not only that, but as Menachem Begin always pointed out, that until the founding of the modern-day state of Israel, the Jews were also called Palestinians. That's what they called the people who lived in the land of Israel. And there were a lot of Jews in the land of Israel before the state was ever founded, and they were also called Palestinians. There was a picture that was circulating on social media a little while ago of the Palestinian soccer team, I believe it was, from I think it was the 1936 Olympic Games, 1932 Olympic Games, somewhere before World War II. And everyone wanted to show that this was a proof that the Palestinians were a people before the state of Israel. And then they did some research and found out that all the members of the Palestinian soccer team were in fact Jewish, because that's what it was called. The Jerusalem Post was called the Palestinian Post. It was a Jewish newspaper. So anyways, just a little historical accuracy, which is what we're trying to have here in Back to the Past, so you know where these things came from. But be it as it may, after the 7-year war, pretty much the Philistines and the Jebusites are the only ones that are left. And the conquest ends in the year 1266 before the Common Era. And then it's a 7-year process to divide up the land. So 7 years of conquering the land, 7 years of dividing up the land. So each of the 12 tribes could divide up the land. And finally, in the year 1258 before the Common Era, the land's divided. All of the 12 tribes are in their sections, and that is what happens. Now, Joshua lives for about another 13 years at this point. Strangely, before Joshua passes away, he makes no succession of leadership like Moshe did. Moshe left Joshua in charge. Joshua leaves nobody in charge. Not only that, but he disbands any remnant of a central government. He disbands the central army, and he basically says it's every tribe for themselves. Now, that's a whole debate as to why he did that, if that was wise to do, not so wise to do. But his intent was that now the time period of Moshe has ended. I'm the student of Moshe. I'm leaving this world. We have to go into the new world order, which is going to be 12 tribes living for themselves. So it was states' rights. Like that was the Jewish way after Joshua. So Joshua passes away in the year 1245 before the Common Era. Before he passes away, he finishes writing his book. So the first book of the prophets, the book of Joshua, is written by Joshua. Joshua finishes it before he passes away. And a lot of the history that we have from that time period is straight out of that book. Again, there's other sources too. There's Josephus, there's others. But the book of Joshua is definitely a big source, and that was written by Joshua himself. Now, after Joshua passes away, that enters a 17-year time period where the leaders are the Zikanim, the elders. The elders are mentioned a lot of times in the Torah. Amongst the elders, that is Caleb, that's Pinchas, great name. That's the elders. And they rule the Jewish people for 17 years, still with some sort of centrality going on. But after that time period, in the year 1228 before the Common Era, there's no centrality whatsoever. There's every tribe for themselves. Every tribe has their own leadership. And there's certain tribes that over the next 350 years become more dominant than others. So we look at their leader, their judge, as sort of the leader of the Jewish people because their tribe is dominant over everybody else. And that's what we're going to pick up next week, right back here on Back to the Past, with the time period of the judges, which will begin in the year 1228 before the Common Era, with Asniel ben Kenaz, who we mentioned before, who will be the first of the judges of the Jewish people. I hope that everyone has a great week, and let's just see if we have any questions here in the question box. So Levi asked a question, wasn't it 600,000 Jews that left Egypt. So we're told there's 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. That, and if you extrapolate that, then most of them were married, and therefore that's 1.2 million, and there were already kids. It was somewhere around 3 million Jews at that time period. Thank you, Jason Hyman. Glad you like it. Hey, Uri, I'm glad you're here watching. And everyone else, thanks for joining in. Thanks for liking it. Be sure to share this with your friends. You can share it here on Facebook. You can share the YouTube post. You can share the podcast and help us with the Back to the Past revolution. Everyone have a great week and a great Shabbos, and we'll talk to you more next week.